Chaplin knew better, Franklin Roosevelt knew better, and Winston Churchill knew better. But there weren't a lot of people in the public, the cultural arena, who were willing to go against that particular mindset, that America didn't have to worry about Adolf Hitler. Chaplin was willing to put himself out there, which earned him the enmity of a lot of people.
I'm thrilled to introduce a true luminary in the literary and cinematic world, none other than author extraordinaire Scott Eyman. With an impressive portfolio of meticulously researched biographies and enthralling explorations of Hollywood's golden age, Scott has become a household name for those who crave a deeper understanding of the lives behind the legends. From the glitz and glamour of old Hollywood to the pages of iconic historical figures, Eyman's words uniquely make history come alive. Scott Eyman's latest book, Charlie Chaplin vs. America, When Art, Sex, and Politics Collided, is set for publication on October 31st, 2023, Halloween. It was a fascinating read, and the writing style makes it a joy to consume. I highly recommend that you get your hands on a copy as soon as possible. Scott, thank you so much for being here today.
Good to be here, John.
I want to jump right in. A question I like to ask is, I like to bring up first is, what brought you to this subject? But then I found as I read the book, you mentioned that it had been a 60-year project. Please tell the audience why Charlie Chaplin is important to you and the movie-watching audience.
Well, he's important to me because he was my entry drug, basically, into silent movies and for broadening out to old movies in general. I had seen clips of him on the old Robert Youngson documentaries from the 1950s when comedy was king and things like that. But I'd never seen Chaplin uncut, as it were, until I was, I think, 12 years old. 12 years old, yeah, I was 12. And I bought an 8mm printed Easy Street from Black Hawk Films in Davenport, Iowa. And I was entranced immediately. And I couldn't figure out why, because the plot was ordinary, the filmmaking was nothing extraordinary, but he was extraordinary, which proved to me that you don't have to have an extraordinary plot. You just need to have extraordinary actors. And I was off and running at that point. And he really fired the starting gun for me in terms of my passion for old movies, for silent film.
Okay. I guess I came up more in the Buster Keaton era, and now I understand why Chaplin wasn't so prominent during my younger years.
Sure.
Charlie Chaplin grew up in Dickensian poverty with a drunk father and a mentally ill mother. Family was institutionalized several times. Is it possible that some of the hate for Charlie Chaplin that Americans have was that he was living the American dream without being an American?
I think that was probably a factor, that he never became a citizen, but he regarded himself as a lone wolf by necessity, because the English, the tender mercies of the English juvenile system had certainly failed him. His family had failed him, except for his brother, Sidney, who never failed him. His mother had failed him through no fault of her own, simply because of her schizophrenia. So he was basically on his own from before puberty. So he didn't have that sense of social conditioning that most people have with a semi-conventional or conventional upbringing, amidst family, friends, going to church, this, that, and the other thing. He simply wasn't a part of any of that. He grew up on the streets, A, and B, he grew up in the theater, in English vaudeville, and later in American vaudeville when the Carno Company, where he was working, spent 3 years in America. So he didn't have that social conditioning that other people had. So he regarded himself as English, but he didn't have any particular allegiance to the English system. He was anti-monarchist, for instance. He thought the whole royalty thing was absurd, although he accepted a knighthood in his old age. But that was certainly understandable. So he simply didn't have that idea of any nationality as a particular part of his identity, the way most of us do through social conditioning, because he didn't have any social conditioning, essentially. So when he came to America and became rich and famous and never took out American citizenship, the professional patriots took that amiss. As a friend of his noted, a friend named Max Eastman, what people didn't understand was he was born in England and came to America and made his fortune. If the reverse had been true, if he'd been born in America and went to England and made his fortune, he wouldn't have taken out English citizenship either. He simply didn't have that gene of allegiance to any country. He's always referred to himself as a citizen of the world.
Okay. Charlie Chaplin was often presented as being a Jew, which he wasn't. But how did the continual use of Judaism as a club to beat Charlie Chaplin cause the American public to turn against him?
I don't think it caused the American public to turn against him. A lot of things caused the American public to turn against him. Basically, 10 to 15 years of demonization in media, and the failure of his film, A Shiver Do, certainly didn't help. I don't think. I mean, the American public in the 1930s and 40s was certainly anti-Semitic. I mean, that counts for the utter refusal to get involved with World War II and Hitler until Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941. We just wanted, it wasn't our problem. We didn't have to deal with it. Hitler could do whatever he wanted to do, and we'd make a separate peace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And isolationism was the predominant ruling phase of the American electorate, probably by 65% margin. But Chaplin knew better, Franklin Roosevelt knew better, and Winston Churchill knew better. But there weren't a lot of people in the public, the cultural arena, who were willing to go against that particular mindset that America didn't have to worry about Adolf Hitler. Chaplin was willing to put himself out there, which earned him the enmity of a lot of people.
Yeah, just following up on that, I was struck that Charlie Chaplin could be criticized for advocating for a second front to help the Soviet Union when it was the policy created at the conferences by the Allied leaders of World War II, and was supported by the invasion of North Africa in 42, of Sicily and Italy in 43, and finally the invasion of France in 1944. And during this time, we were allied with the USSR and China. Would you like to give your thoughts on that? How he can be punished for following American policy or supporting American policy?
Well, yeah, but there was a great deal of debate about that particular American policy. And it's understandable if you place it in the context, because Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact, a couple of years before things broke down between them, and suddenly Russia became our ally. So for the right wing in America, Russia was never going to be our ally. They were our enemy in waiting. And the fact that we were temporarily allied in fighting Hitler was virtually irrelevant, because they figured we would beat Hitler, okay, and after that, Russia would go back to being our enemy, which is basically the way it worked out. So you have to give them some points for prescience on that. But Chaplin was all in because he thought there were two prongs to his thoughts. For one thing, two of his sons were in the U.S. Army, in Patton's Third Army. And he was petrified, of course, about their staying alive. And he thought the more Russia was involved in the war, the sooner the war would end, which exactly turned out to be the case, because Hitler insanely invaded Russia and basically destroyed what was left of his army. And also, he just thought that he believed in a pincer in terms of it wasn't just America and England fighting in one direction. We needed Russia fighting from a second direction to spread out Hitler's defenses and thin them out, as it were. So it was a complicated military analysis, but nobody was interested in making a complicated military analysis. It was a good guys versus bad guys thing. But I think Chaplin was right in one respect. Simple logistics and expedience was necessary for Russia to be involved on our side, and vice versa. That said, they had to be eyed warily because Stalin was Stalin.
Right. And I guess you pointed out in the book that Chaplin didn't think Stalin was exterminating people for ethnicity, but he actually was doing that.
He was completely wrong about that.
Yeah.
Stalin was anti-Semitic and homophobic and any number of other disgusting traits, but we didn't know it in 1942, 1943.
Right. Okay. Could you weigh in on two women that profoundly affected Charlie Chaplin's life and career, Joan Barry and Ona O'Neill?
Well, Joan Barry was a woman with whom he had a relationship with in 1940, beginning in 1942. I believe she was 23 or 24. He would have been 53 or so. She wanted to be in the movies. She came to Hollywood. She thought she had the makings of a movie star. Chaplin did too for a time. He signed her to a contract. Eventually, the relationship shifted to the personal, as those relationships often do. She was his mistress for a while. She proved erratic, to say the least, emotionally. She saw other people as well as Chaplin. had relationships with other people as well as Chaplin. She disappeared from his life. Then she came back and announced she was pregnant, and he was the father. He inquired as to when this conception allegedly took place. She mentioned December 23rd. He realized that he couldn't be the father because they hadn't had sex on December 23rd of the previous year. So he refused to deal with her anymore. She went to head a hopper and said Chaplin was the father of her child, and the ball began rolling downhill. He was eventually prosecuted for violating the Mann Act, which involved transporting women across state lines for moral purposes, and in a paternity suit brought by Joan Barry and her lawyers. He was acquitted on the Mann Act after the jury deliberated for about an hour because it was obviously a trumped-up charge. The paternity suit, the blood test he took proved he wasn't the father of the child, validating his defense, and the jury found him against him anyway, probably simply because of the combined publicity regarding his support for Russia and his predilection for young women, which was further amplified when he married Una O'Neill, who was 18 at the time. And this was shortly right after the Joan Barry trial. And Chaplin was in his early 50s, as I said. Una O'Neill was the daughter of Eugene O'Neill, the playwright. She was alienated from her father. She had gone to private schools in New York City, was close friends with numerous other debutantes, and had no particular ambition or focus in her life because she was 18 years old. They met in Hollywood. She was taking a screen test in Hollywood. They met at a party. They were immediately attracted to each other. They fell in love. They married. They stayed married for the rest of Chaplin's life, and they had 8 children together.
Amazing. I didn't write that out as a question, but the Shadow and Substance script, I believe it was Shadow and Substance, he had proposed that for Barry and then later on for Ona, but was that, I'm not familiar with that story. Was that anything about, was he creating his ideal woman in that? It's
a play. It wasn't an original script. It's an adaptation of a play about a domestic, Irish domestic, who sees the Virgin Mary, I believe.
Okay.
That's the nature of the play, and it had been done on Broadway, not terribly successfully, but it was a pre-existing property that he had bought.
Gotcha. Charlie Chaplin, I feel, was caught up in a frenzy that included earlier Batty Arbuckle, later Lionel Atwell, Errol Flynn. Was sexual misconduct a tool used against Hollywood, or did it reflect changing mores in America?
I think it was complicated by the fact that Chaplin liked young girls. I mean, he had numerous relationships with age-appropriate women as well. I'm not saying he wasn't exclusively attracted to young girls. He was attracted to women, is what he was. So, no, I think that was a tool used against him by his political enemies, basically, as a convenient vulnerability that they found. And they went after him, and they went after him consistently. And in the end, they won.
Okay, very good. This next one's a political question. If you don't want to get into it, we'll just cut it out. When the attack began, after Charlie Chaplin began working on The Dictator, you say in essence that the American boom was peaking, America firsters were strong, isolationist Republicans controlled Congress, and Hitler wasn't our problem. I can't help but think now we have rising neo-Nazi issues. The majority of Americans favor a kind of a brand of isolationism, and isolationist Republicans control Congress, and Putin is not our problem. Was communism so feared that it was okay to get in bed with fascists?
I'm not sure about that. What working on the book really showed me, though, in a way I hadn't expected, because the book, I started working on the book in January 2020. So it's been almost 4 years now. What it really showed me is that everything that's happening now in America has happened before. And I have no doubt that it will happen again. That the kind of authoritarian politics that we're currently assailed by are like a low-level recurring infection in the body politic. And antibiotics don't seem to work. Cultural antibiotics don't seem to work. It comes around every 20, 30, 40 years, whether you want it to or not. And that's just the way it is. Because what Chaplin went through in the 40s and 50s was not the first time this has happened. The blacklist era began concurrently in 1947, 48, and he was part of that. He didn't start out to be part of it, but he became caught up in it, even though he had nothing to do with it, ostensibly. And here we are again, where the levers of government are being used for social conditioning in terms of what people are allowed to read, what children are allowed to be taught, the fear of the unknown, fear of the other. It's all happened before, and it's all going to happen again.
Well, I don't know how I feel about that. I was struck by one of the quotes you used in the book from Westbrook Pegler, referring to Charlie Chaplin as a communist. He was questioning Charlie Chaplin about being a communist. Pegler used the reference cheapness, and I think that's code for being Jewish. And then he used Gestapo tactics. He said he used Gestapo tactics to run Barry out of town. What are your thoughts on the attacker relying on general prejudice and branding him a commie and a fascist at the same time?
Well, that's tough to do. Well, Pegler was a particularly virulent case. He was probably the most vicious columnist of his era or of any other era. Later became a flaming anti-Semite. The only people that would publish him was the John Birch Society. And I'm waiting for the John Birch Society to be reconstituted. So, yeah, Chaplin did have a reputation for being tight with a buck, which actually was partially true. He was generous in some ways, but he always was conscious of his poverty as a child, and was always conscious that it could happen again if the dominoes began falling in the wrong direction. So he tended his balance carefully. I think his concern over money is essentially why he ended up in Switzerland, because of the favorable tax basis of living in Switzerland, of being a full-time resident in Switzerland. And also he wanted to lower the temperature, because he'd lived in this political inferno of America in the blacklist era in the late 40s and early 50s, and got kicked out of the country. And I think he wanted to lower the temperature and get some peace and quiet in his life, which he did. He lived there the rest of his life with Una and the family. Unfortunately, it adversely affected his work.
Right. Okay. I spoke with author and film noir expert Alan K. Rohde, and he told me that in Hollywood, the mafia used the threat of being called a communist to break unions and cow personnel into doing what they wanted. Was Charlie Chaplin in any way smeared as by the mafia types, and especially in light of him being part of United Artists, which kept control of the money and the process?
No. I don't think he had any problem at all with the mob. The mob was much more concerned with controlling unions. The mob saw unions as the way in which they could get a lot of money, and succeeded to a great extent. They weren't, and also Chaplin was such a lone wolf. He was a lone wolf within United Artists, really, which was, and the problem with United Artists was it was formed by Griffith and Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin. William S. Hart was in it, but he dropped out almost immediately. All of whom basically would control their own production and put up the money for their own films independently. And they would own the bulk of the profits. They would own, I believe, 75 or 80% of the monies that returned, in return for putting up the money, their own money, to make the films. And it worked out in a sort of a way, but in the larger context, it didn't work out, because the only people who really made money at United Artists were the founders, people that came in dragging their own bankroll with them. Sam Goldwyn, David Selznick, Alexander Korda, all came in to bulk up production, because the problem was that Chaplin only made a movie every 4 or 5 years. Douglas Fairbanks retired in 1933, or Mary Pickford retired in 1933. So they had production. They didn't have any movies coming out, so they had to bring in other people to make movies in order to support the corporation. But you couldn't make any money at United Artists as an independent producer. It was very difficult. And they all eventually would drift away, Korda and Selznick and the rest. So basically, United Artists was set up as a convenience for a handful of extremely independent filmmakers / artists. It didn't make a lot of sense as a business organization, which was a problem that bedeviled it until Pickford and Fairbanks eventually sold it in the early 1950s, and it became the most successful independent operation in the movie business for over 25 years, until Heaven's Gate, really. So, but that was a totally different management structure and a totally different business operation. UA under the original founders there wasn't enough money coming through United Artists to interest the mafia. Let me put it that way.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The mafia was much more interested in MGM and 20th Century Fox and Paramount because they were business operations run as businesses.
Gotcha.
United Artists was run as a convenience operation for the founders.
Okay. It's very interesting. Regarding movies such as the Red Dawn remake, digitally replacing the Chinese flags after they were hacked, and Top Gun 2 making the enemy an unknown country, should films make a stand on social and political ideas?
Depends on the filmmaker. If they want to put themselves out there, sure, why not?
So you don't think it's outside their purview, that their purview is just entertainment?
No.
Okay.
No. Charlie Chaplin wouldn't have existed if all he was doing was entertaining. The Great Dictator wouldn't exist if all he thought he was doing was entertaining. Modern Times wouldn't exist if he was just being entertaining. They're all very plugged into what's going on in the world, outside the studio walls at the period Chaplin was making them. And that's why they're still relevant today, because nothing has changed that much, really. I mean, you look at Modern Times and it's about people's adherence to tools despite past the point of sanity. What would Chaplin have make out of smartphones? And it involves drug addiction and labor unrest and civil and civic unrest. Modern Times hasn't dated at all.
You just watched that recently. It's a very amazing film. But don't, if I'm reading it right, don't I see a pushback every time? Maybe it's when actors try to make a stand outside of the movies, but I was thinking that there's a general trend now pushing back against Hollywood to come out with a position in a movie.
That's always been a factor. There have always been people who want to put themselves out there and make statements, and there's also a group of people who say movies are for entertainment. That happened in the 1920s. It happened in the 30s with the Warner Brothers were making Wild Boys of the Road, and I Was a Fugitive from a Chain Gang and very socially conscious films. It happened in the 50s when Burt Lancaster was making Sweet Smell of Success, or Birdman of Alcatraz. It happened in the 60s when they were making Easy Rider and all those movies that involved nudity and sex and carnal knowledge and all this, that, and the other thing. There's always been people protesting against what are basically regarded by posterity as cutting-edge movies in every era.
Okay, so same as it ever was.
Basically.
Okay, all right.
Action produces reaction.
Okay, you mentioned this before, and I think one of your conclusions, so it's Charlie Chaplin is a testament to perseverance, and his getting the Oscar and his knighthood and his film's continued popularity really how does his Vindication later in life reflect back on his perseverance trend?
Well, Chaplin was a commercial monument from 1913 when he started making movies to 1947, basically. He had his first flop in 1947 with Monsieur Verdoux. Limelight, the film he made the year he was banned from America, or his re-entry permit was rescinded, rather, although that amounted to ban, was a great commercial success all over the world and didn't do badly in America either, especially compared to Monsieur Verdoux. So he was, with one single exception, a very, very commercial filmmaker throughout his career in America. The two films he made after he left America were both very marginal movies. So you can really say his nonconformity worked for him, I believe, as an artist, in terms of both the films themselves and their relevance in the modern era, and with the audience of the period and since, because they don't conform to the conventional wisdom of the era in which they were made.
Okay.
They conform to Chaplin's morality, not conventional social morality.
Very good. So you've written so many great books, from John Wayne to Cary Grant to John Ford, all across the spectrum. Which one is your favorite out of the books you've written, and why?
I can tell you which ones I enjoyed writing the most. That I could tell you, because some books are more pleasurable to write than others. bizarre reasons. But I can't tell you which one is the best or the most effective, because by the time you're finished with the book, you're too close to the book. You know, you've read every sentence 150 times, and the jokes aren't funny, and the drama's not dramatic. It's the same problem a filmmaker has. After a year of, you shoot the film, and then you sit with it for 9 or 10 months or a year, and you're doing the special effects, and you're editing and re-editing and cutting and adding this and subtracting that. And after a while, you have no idea what you're looking at. It feels like oatmeal. It's the same thing with a book. You're overly saturated with it. So your first reader or readers are crucial. I can tell you there were a couple books that I really enjoyed loved working. My Lubitsch biography, I loved the entire 3 or 4 years I was on it. I loved working on Hank and Jim. I loved working on Chaplin. Chaplin because it was the fulfillment of a dream deferred.
Right.
Because I always loved him, but I never really thought I was going to write about him. But the pandemic gave me the chance to write about him, basically.
Okay.
The Hank and Jim, because I loved both actors, and they're completely different actors, and they're completely different human beings, and yet they had a bond of love and friendship that never was breached. And I found that ennobling and instructive, both personally and professionally. Lubitsch, because I always loved his films. And luckily, when I wrote the book, there were a lot of people still alive who knew Lubitsch. And I spent all this time in California talking to them, and they were a lot like Lubitsch. People like Billy Wilder, people like William Wyler, people like Wyler's wife, Tally. Because Lubitsch was the personality he was, the people that gathered around Lubitsch, his circle of friends, were a lot like him. So I was able to intuit who he was and what he was from the joie de vivre and the humor and the vitality, the intellectual vitality of his friends and his relatives that I talked to. So it was a surprising experience because I hadn't expected that. I thought people would talk about him objectively and with a certain amount of dispassion, but instead people's faces just lit up, and it was like they were talking about their favorite uncle or their favorite grandfather, and everybody talked of him with love, except there was only one actor who didn't like him, but everybody else I talked to, and there were probably 30 or 40, including his doctor, 30 or 40 people, everybody else adored him as a human being, and that was unexpected.
Very nice. This is kind of a fluff question as we start to wind down. Which Chaplin film do you enjoy the most and why, if you can answer that question?
I can tell you I'm not that crazy about Monsieur Verdoux. It feels like homework to me. I love The Kid. I love The Gold Rush. I think City Lights is probably his greatest film objectively, viewed as a critic, shall we say. I'm not sure. It might be too insular for a general audience to really go for. I think the general audience's favorite would be Modern Times, because it's eternally relevant, because it doesn't really seem to age in terms of the content and what the movie is saying and what it's about. I like The Great Dictator a lot. I think it's the most courageous movie he ever made, and one of the most courageous movies anybody ever made, because nobody wanted to make it. United Artists didn't really want to make it. The British Foreign Office didn't want it made because Neville Chamberlain was the prime minister, and he was engaged in appeasing Hitler and hoping he'd go away. Franklin Roosevelt wanted it made, and Chaplin wanted it made, and that was about it, really. Mm-hmm. The letter in the book that I reproduced from Jack Warner. Jack Warner had a conference with Roosevelt in the White House, and Roosevelt had brought up Chaplin's plans to shoot The Great Dictator. And he told Warner that he thought it was a really important movie, and Chaplin should go ahead with it, even though there were terrible headwinds, because Chaplin wasn't even sure the UA would distribute the film. He might, so he said, "I'll rent halls, I'll put up tents, I'll show the film any way I can," and I have no doubt that he would have. And he put up his own $1,400,000 of his own money, considerable amount of money in 1939 when he started shooting, and he starts shooting in September 39. It comes out in October 40. And America's still an isolationist country because Pearl Harbor's not until December 41. And it's a huge hit, in spite of a lot of people who thought he was sticking his toe in places he shouldn't have been, because politics are serious and movies are not serious. And Chaplin understood that you can't reason with a mad dog. You can't make deals with a mad dog. They won't abide by the deal. You have to defeat them or kill them. And that's what the great dictator is ultimately about. You cannot appease people like Hitler. And Chamberlain didn't understand that. Churchill did. Roosevelt did. Chaplin did. There weren't an awful lot of people who understood that.
Amazing. For my final question, what have I forgotten to ask you that you want to say about this book?
The reason I wrote it is because nobody else did, basically. There are dozens and dozens of books about Charlie Chaplin, which actually stopped me from writing about Charlie Chaplin, because I figured, well, everybody's done it. One way or the other, everybody's done it. And I was sitting there in January of 2020, and the world's closing down, as the pandemic slides across the world. And I had nothing to do. I just shipped off Cary Grant, and I was twiddling my thumbs. And generally, I take a 6 months or a year off between books to recharge my batteries. But I thought, well, who knows how this is going to go, this pandemic thing. So, and I thought about Chaplin, and then I started just leafing through all these books that I have in my library. And none of them really got into the nuts and bolts of what happened and the mechanics of what happened and the snowball effect of what happened, of him gradually being ostracized socially, politically by the right wing, and the effect it had on the American public, the general American. Even the David Robinson book, which is an excellent book, I think, kind of fluffs through it in a couple pages. And I just thought, well, okay, maybe it's time. And then as I was working on the book, with the cooperation of the Chaplin estate and the Library of Congress when they finally reopened, and the Nixon Library when they finally reopened, and the Truman Library when they finally reopened, all this material, putting it together was like working out this magnificent jigsaw puzzle that no one else had, because no one else had ever approached it from the micro view. Everybody else had done Chaplin through the macro, and I was doing basically a micro view of this one specific period in his life, what led to it, what happened during it, and what happened after it. So it was the narrative was different. The narrative was difficult because it's not as, the reality is that it reads smoother than it actually was. It was a chaotic period for him where he was on a roller coaster, getting jerked around constantly, sometimes of his own making. But it was a very jerky ride. And I didn't want to make it a jerky ride. You want to make it comprehensible in a narrative way. So that was difficult to achieve because there were so many factoids and nuggets and things happening at the same time simultaneously. So it was a difficult book to pull off technically, if indeed I pulled it off.
Fantastic. That I was just noted, you said you did it during the pandemic, and that puts you in some pretty good company with Sir Isaac Newton and William Shakespeare, both working in the pandemic and coming out with something really wonderful.
Well, I wouldn't put myself in that league, but no, it's a different experience when you don't leave the house for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months at a time, as opposed to, so your concentration is not being diverted, and there's an upside to that, and there's also a downside to that, because I think you can easily lose your objectivity because you're so focused that you get a little OCD, and you don't really want that, because just because you think it's working doesn't mean anybody else is going to think it's working, because you lose your objectivity that way.
Listen, this book is fantastic. I really enjoyed reading it. I looked at it when I got it, and I'm like, it's a lot to go through, but it just reads so well, and it's so fascinating and so well put together. Congratulations, and I highly recommend this book to everybody.
Thanks,
Get
John.
it as soon as you can.
Appreciate it.
Okay. And before we sign off, where can people find you? Where they can get the book? What else do you want to? You have social media you want to talk about?
I do. ScottEyman.com. Yeah, I'm around. I'm not hard to find.
Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much again for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and I think the people are really going to enjoy it.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
All right. Good. We're done. Rebecca, I'll be in contact with Rebecca on the publication. She wants me to hold it till closer to October 31st.
Sure.
And I'll do that. But it'll come out on podcast and it'll come out on YouTube. And it'll include all the links and everything.
I'll look forward to it, John.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Have
sir.
a good day. Stay dry.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, right.